The 1980s was the era of excess, probably because of all the extracurricular activities they were doing, just to please the YouTube advertising gods, or just call it snowboarding. Wink wink. But for real though, everything was turned up to 11, and nothing since has been the same, or anything before the 80s was like that, if you follow me. Two immediate examples that spring to mind are Group B rally cars and Group C endurance races. While the popularity and manufacturer interest has been brought back with the new hypercar and LMDH regulations that allow for the overlap between the WEC and IMSA, Group B is one that is consigned to the history books. Purpose-built rally cars built to a rulebook that was merely a suggestion rather than an actual thing to abide by, and it resulted in some of the most insane creations ever sent up a dirt road in Kenya. And other countries, obviously, well, except Monte Carlo and Corsica, but you get the point. It also means that somewhere out there is a road-legal mid-engine 205 GTI, which is one of my lottery cars, along with the Lexus LFA. The 80s, as Clarkson, Hammond and May attested when they did that hot hatch challenge that one time, were turbo crazy. It was the buzzword of the time, much like digital was in the early 2000s, or HD was about 10 years ago. I guess hybrid or all-electric is the current one, or putting I in front of stuff to make it sound more high-tech. But rally and endurance racing weren't the only series where the turbos went to 11, but in Formula 1 they did it too. The year is 1986, and the car we're going to be looking at today is the Lotus 98T, and the 98T is going to be specifically looked at because it coincides with something really cool. Now normally I don't do sponsor placements in videos and things like that, but a company got in contact that has come up with something really cool. Today's video has been done in conjunction with REC Watches, a timepiece manufacturer that does things slightly differently. They've been making watches infused with the DNA of famous racing cars since 2014, and their special edition watches have been made from parts of Steve McQueen's TR6, Carroll Shelby's prototype Mustang, and parts of John DeLorean's personal DMC-12. The latest project for this Danish company is something incredibly special, a timepiece that features parts of Ayrton Senna's Lotus 98T chassis number 4 from 1986, and REC has worked closely with classic Team Lotus over the last 2 years to design and build this watch, and now it's on pre-sale with 20% off for any pre-orders. The watch uses parts fabricated from the original parts of the original car, such as the aluminium plenum tubes to create the outer chapter rings and the tachometer scales. As such, the 98T4 timepiece is limited to just 989 examples, each one containing many callbacks to the original car that is still raced to this day. Things such as the black and gold colour tones that take inspiration from its iconic livery, the large 12 that's skeletonized onto the rotor, and the backplate decoration is designed to look like the Renault Turbo V6 that powered Senna in chassis number 4 for the second half of the 1986 season. To learn more about REC watches and to see their history and learn more about their motorsport passion, you can check them out via the link in the description. Lotus was in a difficult place through the majority of the 1980s. After the death of Colin Chapman of a heart attack in the latter part of 1982, the team was struggling to cope with the loss of their leader and visionary, who was the driving force of the team. In 1983 and 1984, Lotus did not win a single Grand Prix, even with Nigel Mansell behind the wheel. And when Nigel left for Williams at the end of 1984, he was replaced by possibly the hottest property in Formula 1 at that time, Ayrton Senna. In only Senna's second race for the team at an absolutely soaking wet Portuguese Grand Prix, he won the race. At the very next round at Imola, Elio De Angelis took a victory, and Senna would win again at Spa later on in the season as Lotus recovered to 71 points and a 4th place in the championship. But while De Angelis scored consistent points finishes, Senna's car was breaking down quite a bit. So for 1986, Lotus definitely had a base on which they could work with. They had quite possibly the fastest driver over one lap in the history of Formula 1 in one of their cars, and if they could get the car working, then maybe that driver could convert those pole positions into race wins and maybe win a championship. But before the season started in 1986, there was a little bit of a controversy surrounding the drivers. De Angelis was heading off to Brabham for 1986, and Lotus had initially wanted Derek Warwick to be in the second car. Warwick was going to be out of a drive as the Renault factory team had pulled out, but would still be supplying engines, and Lotus looked like a good destination for him as it would keep the sponsor, John Player Cigarettes, happy because British company, British driver. I managed to dig through the Motorsport magazine archives to find an actual article from 1986 talking about it. So rather than hearing 97th hand information from 2024 off Reddit, because this guy said, he knows a guy that knows this guy that knows this guy, and that kind of thing, we're going to be getting what people were saying and thinking in this time frame. Lotus boss Peter Ward told journalists at the time that Senna was absolutely their #1 star through the 1985 season and would be into 1986. Senna had won 2 races in his first season in Black and Gold, been on pole several times, and had been leading several races before his Renault engine expired or other Lotus-related happenings happened. Magazines, newspapers and media all over the world were waxing lyrical over Senna's skills and talents, and the real question would be who was going to be in the other car. Warwick was the hot favourite at the time, but there were other discussions happening too. Now, Dennis Jenkinson, who wrote that Motorsport article way back in 1986, was erring on the side of caution. If Warwick really was that good, then maybe Lotus would have signed him up already, but that wasn't the case. There was still a lot of things going on. Warwick was considered to be in the top 10 drivers on the grid in this time period. He'd finished 14th the previous year, but was still considered to be more than good enough to drive for a top team. But the issue for Warwick was that Senna wanted the engineers to be focused on his car to make sure it made the end of races without being subjected to an engine failure or otherwise Lotusing on him. In the words of the Motorsport magazine article, Senna wanted someone who wasn't going to drive fast enough to put a strain on Lotus's resources. While Warwick might have been able to finish 5th or 6th most races subject to the car working, Senna was wary that it might cause too much of an issue. So Senna suggested to Lotus they hire Mauricio Gugelmin instead. Gugelmin had been doing okay at a junior level and would have been trouble-free for want of a better phrase. If they'd hired Warwick, there might have been the possibility of a bit of the old British bias when Senna would have been the guy that was going to win the races. But because of John Player wanting a British driver in the car because of sponsorship and other business-related stuff, Gugelmin didn't get the drive and wouldn't end up in Formula 1 for another few years. Warwick would be out of a drive with him supposed to go to Tolman before they sold out to the Benetton Knitwear Company and would ultimately go to Brabham when De Angelis was tragically killed in a testing accident. Instead, Lotus hired a British driver that wasn't going to cause Senna much issue on the whole performance front, John Crichton Stewart, better known as Johnny Dumfries. Johnny had managed to have a decent junior career. He dominated the British Formula 3 Championship in 1984 and was runner-up to Ivan Capelli in European Formula 3 that same year. Those series now, I think, are called GB3 and Formula Regional or something. I don't know how the FIA has restructured everything, but either way, those 2 series at the time were the series to be in on the way up. Highly prestigious junior categories. For 1986, he'd be getting a runabout in Lotus's new 98T. Lotus took all the best bits of the 97T and made them better, whilst trying to make the rest of the car better, or just less fragile and, work properly. But because the FIA had restricted the fuel tanks to 195 litres now, the car now sat a little bit lower so that it would help generate underbody downforce, because ground effect had been banned, and the cars were now run probably about that far above the ground just to try and generate something. And they also had the EF15B engine in the car, which was the new improved engine from Renault, and they also had a 5-speed Heumann gearbox. To an extent, we'll get to that in a bit. The EF15B was the first Formula 1 engine to utilise pneumatic valve springs and static ignition. This in turn enabled it to rev to 12,500 RPM and produce 900 brake horsepower in race mode, thanks in part to the 2 Garrett turbochargers that were bolted to it. But Renault, who had pioneered turbocharging in the late 1970s, was still trying to overcome the problems with this tech that had now been around for nearly 10 years. Renault were often the fastest qualifiers out there thanks to their cars producing way more torque in the low end, but when they had to do more than one lap it was a case of when, not if, the car would conk out or not. By around 1984, the other teams and manufacturers were able to go to off-the-shelf turbocharger makers, add the boost kits to their engines and go racing, and now those engines, particularly the likes of BMW and Honda, were rinsing Renault power every other Sunday. But we're in 1986 now, at the height of the turbo war. For qualifying, these cars were chucking out amounts of power. This was the year that the BMWs in the Brabhams were thought to be outputting around 1400 horsepower when they were turned up for qualifying, a number that grows by about another 100 horsepower every 10 years. The cars had qualifying engines, gearboxes and tyres that were good for about 15 miles before being chucked in the bin. Don't let anybody have you believe that these engine power figures were the race power figures. Lotus and Renault had to try and get the right balance of power and durability. They also had to try and figure out the best way of putting as much power down on the road without any of the neck-snapping turbo lag that these cars were capable of. The car itself was penned by Gérard Ducarouge, one of Ligier's long-time employees who came over to Lotus for 1986 and tried to improve on the old 97. Ducarouge's design was a smooth and aesthetically pleasing one that was able to get a good aero and mechanical grip balance that would allow Senna to lob the car hard into corners and give him the grip on the exit as the turbo kicked in. It also has to be said here that Senna was running with a 5-speed Hewland gearbox while Dumfries had the 6-speed version, a gearbox that was just, well, woefully unreliable. The season started well for Lotus and for Brazil. At the Brazilian Grand Prix at Jacarapagua, Senna blitzed Piquet to pole by over 3/4 of a second and was over a second faster than Mansell in the other Williams. Then, in the race, Senna bolted off into the distance after surviving lap 1 contact with Mansell, but later on, Senna's thirsty Renault had drunk too much fuel and the Brazilian had to go into a fuel-saving run, whereupon he was overtaken by Piquet and finished second. The second race at Jerez was proof enough that if the Lotus worked in Senna's hands, it was going to work incredibly well. Pole and the win for Senna, but at the San Marino Grand Prix it was 3 for 3 in pole positions, but a wheel bearing failure meant 9 lost points. Following this was Monaco, where he just couldn't match Prost and Rosberg's McLarens, and would be second to Mansell on the streets of Detroit. Senna then crashed in France and retired at Brands Hatch before he had to watch his fuel light once again at Hockenheim and come second to Piquet like he had done in Brazil. But then again, this was standard for that race. In the pre-refueling era, the drivers hated that track because it was a car killer and a fuel-saving exercise. It meant that after the race at Detroit, Senna was leading the drivers' standings by 3 points over his later number 1 rival Alain Prost, but by the end of the German Grand Prix he'd slipped down to 3rd, 9 points behind Mansell and 2 behind Prost. Lotus meanwhile will be 3rd in the Constructors on 42 points. All of those points scored by Senna. Johnny Dumfries was not having a good time out there. His best result up to the German Grand Prix had been 7th, but his season had been peppered with retirements as his car continuously broke down. There's even a non-qualification there at Monaco where he was 5 seconds off the pace at a race where only 20 people could take the start because Monaco reasons. When he was actually on track, Johnny was running with the likes of Martin Brundle and Philippe Strafe in their Tyrrells, running within the midfield. But because his car wasn't getting the attention that Senna's was, with the exception of 2 races, all of his retirements was some kind of mechanical failure. Senna would also retire at Austria, Italy and Australia as Prost had a resurgent second part of the season to take the championship right at the death. It was really between Prost, Mansell and Piquet for the championship, but it all ended in absolute scenes when Mansell suffered that tyre blowout at the Australian Grand Prix, leaving Prost to take the title. It's definitely a video to do in the future because, colossally, that was Mansell. The Lotus 98T in Senna's hands was by far the fastest car on the grid. It was an absolute rocket ship, but the engine and the fact that Lotus had notorious reliability let it down. Senna scored 8 poles that season, starting half of the season from the front and led countless laps during the races. But whether because of the Renault engine being thirsty, fragile or other reasons, so many wins that season were ripped from his hands. And in another universe, if that car was a bit more reliable, Senna would probably win the championship and Lotus would win a 7th driver's title. Winning the Constructors would have proved to be a lot harder though, given the difference in talent between Senna and Johnny. The 98T would also be the last Lotus Formula 1 car to run in the iconic black and gold of John Player cigarettes. What happened following this season is that Renault withdrew from Formula 1 entirely, so no longer supplying engines, let alone having a team, and Lotus picked up Honda power for 1987, albeit slightly down on power compared to what Williams was running because they got first dibs. In turn, Honda asked for their test driver Satoru Nakajima to have one of the seats, while Senna occupied the other. John Player hacked off because they couldn't have a British driver in one of the seats, pulled their funding, and in turn Lotus signed a deal with Camel cigarettes for 1987, so they went from black and gold to blue and yellow. The 98T, given its raw pace, shape and colour scheme, goes down as one of the most iconic Formula 1 cars in history, as well as being lumped in there with some of the greatest. Maybe I should collate a list or do a collage in a Assetto Corsa showroom of the greatest Formula 1 cars in history, but that depends on if all the cars are there or not. It's a tricky one. I'll try and do something, because I know you people like lists. But it's also proof that raw speed alone isn't what wins championships. While Senna is undoubtedly the fastest driver over one lap in F1 history, if the car can't last more than 30 laps, it's never going to win anything. The driver is only one part of the wider puzzle, but when everything did click into place, that car was a rocket ship, and it would have easily won the championship had it worked properly. In a way then, it could be considered the McLaren MP420 of its day, a car that was ridiculously quick but broke down too often to actually do anything in terms of winning the championship. But that's one for you lot to discuss down in the comments. So then, a look at Senna's Lotus 98T, brought to you by the people of REC Watches. If this has been a fun and educational look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as well, and as ever, go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to REC Watches, Discord, socials, and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to buy me a cold drink or a coffee, and memberships if you want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.